All right, let's call upon Prime Minister to start the debate.
Okay. Testing, testing. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Madam Speaker, in debates like this, one of the most difficult things is often tying in the most tangible benefits to something that's quite abstract, like education. That is exactly what government side is going to be doing for you today. The framework in Asian countries are oftentimes more undeveloped and inept. They are constantly bombarded by the name and the cultural identities that have been fed into us. We say that when you think of the best universities in the world, you tend not to think of Asia because they are constantly overshadowed by the namesake of these foreign countries. We are going to prove to you that it harms Asian education. In setup, first thing, we oppose the Western influence of Western universities in Asian countries. We think this looks like Nottingham University in Malaysia, NYU in Hong Kong, American U of South Korea. Second thing, we stand for local universities and we say they're perfectly sufficient at providing that alternative. We question the idea that they posit to us, and we actually call it quite racist that they think that these universities can't develop with the cream of the crop of their own countries. We're going to tell you how exactly that cream is stolen by the Western influence in these countries.
Point of information, sir.
Third point of setup. We understand that wealthy students and students that are already convinced by this Americana are oftentimes already going to migrate out of these nations. We still think that there's an abundant amount of highly intelligent, highly skilled individuals who, one, still tie a amount of national identity and want to stay in their country to study, but two, also have the ability to, are middle to upper class and have the ability to influence the country by using their privilege. We say that we have to prove two things in this debate. Number one, that the Asian framework of universities without Western influence does improve. And number two, that Asian education is equally sufficient and can build without that Western influence. Before I go on, I'll take the PY.
Would you say that there are inherent differences between Asian and Western education systems that is rooted in ideology and culture?
I would say that these certain ideas that you are taught in Western ideology may differ, but I do not think that in certain Asian countries there aren't those schools of thought either. So I think even in like the most conservative countries, where presumably you have freedom of speech, you are still allowed to teach on liberal ideas and conservative ideas. I don't think that's mutually exclusive. First, 2 points for you today. First thing, Western universities are neo-colonialism. And the second thing is about how the presence of Western education deprives countries of the human capital. First thing about how they are a form of neocolonialism. We have to understand that the immoral hegemonic standard built upon Western ideology and Western identity creates an uninformed consent for these individuals to go into countries. Do not let aught pull the wool over your eyes. Education systems and universities in these countries shape the ability for the country to form. They are oftentimes an extension of that national identity itself. But we say by the mere fact of the cultural standards that have been formed by Eurocentric media, where we glorify the Caucasian population, where we glorify the ideas and ideology given to us by the West, where we were systematically fed in by colonialism, strangled by slavery for decades and centuries, kissing the boots of any white man, of any girl lucky enough to be with a white man, or for any person lucky enough to live in a country of that sort. We say that we were fed inherently with Americana, that we had no consent to, that our ancestors died on that back. What is the impact of this? We say that it crowds out the ability for your local universities to gain adequate amounts of good students. So on both sides, we have a public sector that will always have forms of subsidized education where the lower class will always flock to. But where there are brighter students who are able to access things like tuition, access things like extra classes, extracurriculars, we think oftentimes these students can be swayed by the amount of namesake that can be afforded in these countries. They are liberalized by that ideology. They are therefore attracted to it. We say the trend in Asia is increasingly scary, ladies and gentlemen. All across the Philippines, in Singapore, in Malaysia, you have Western universities coming in and placing down Western capital in Western universities. Two conclusions to this. Number one reason why they will flock to it is because we established that the ideology is already heavily idolized. They heavily idolize the fact that because of the fact that these individuals are white, therefore their ideology is superior. But the second thing is, notice the fact that if they can expand, it likely means that they are one, for profit, and they are very large endowments. This means, ladies and gentlemen, they oftentimes dump the market with cheaper tuition fees and cheaper prices to induct students into their capital. Second point about how the presence of Western education deprives countries of human capital. First thing, we have to notice that they are not tied to the national identity. Universities of Western universities that are abroad are oftentimes credited with the intelligence of their students. So for example, in Yale and US, any achievement credited by a student is not seen as one of Singaporean intelligence. It is seen as one of American education. It is credited and it reasserts and reaffirms that idea that only Western education can allow your locals to be at pride. We say that is something that is insidious. But the second level is, it tangibly affects your ability to it tangibly causes the brain drain within that country on two prongs. First thing, we must notice that thereby, if you have no Western universities, on a net, you would definitely have more of the brighter middle class students within these local universities. We say that means you form a connection with these universities, as university times means that it reminds you of something where you are loved and you are free in your life. This is oftentimes a reason why it causes alumni drain. Many students that go into humanity learn subjects, their only option is oftentimes to go back and teach in the universities that they form those connections with. Therefore, you deprive much of your local source with these universities. The second prong is student drain. So because of a large environment of students that don't get focused into your local universities, you don't get things that improve the name of that universities. Things like important research papers that get posted. Things like having the ability to advocate on like one trailblazer student. Oftentimes, it just takes one student or a few students to create a project or a thesis that can brighten up the name of your university. Notice the fact that none of these Western universities are actually tied to these countries at all. They can leave at any time, and therefore that name becomes tied with them. But not only that, we think in any instance, these students will still flock to these universities, right? These students will still flock to the countries where these Western universities are from a few things. Oftentimes, these countries have exchange programs. We say that the very reason these countries have exchange programs is because they want to feed it further into you to come back to this country and be able to serve us with the intelligence that you have. We say that you're actively stealing students away through that exciting and oftentimes overwhelming respect. So why then are Asian universities sufficiently going to improve? We say with the addition of all of this human capital, it ultimately means that all of your most famous doctors, your most famous lawyers who stay in the country, who are in contention, by the way, we say those individuals are likely to brighten up the names of those universities just by on a chance. If 1 out of 100 students is like a trailblazer or someone famous, we say that happens far more on our side. We'd like to ask them, when exactly do you actually get the improvement in these universities, and why exactly are you willing to reassert the constant amounts of colonialist propaganda? Proud to have proposed.
All right, thank you, Prime Minister, for that speech. Is it okay if I leave my camera off because it helps with the lagging?
Oh yeah, opposition has no problem with that.
All right.
That's
All right,
fine.
thank you. Right, thank you for that speech. Let's invite Leader of Opposition.
What side proposition doesn't understand is that neo-colonialism and idealizing of Western culture is nothing new. What is new, though, is the unprecedented influx of foreigners who are now more willing and able to experience Chinese and Asian culture to a degree that we have never seen before. Because I think that's what they've missed throughout their entire Prime Minister's speech, that this door works both ways, and that you will have people going both in and out of Asia and on net that is good in the context of a globalized society. Before two arguments about intercontinental relationships and changes to the education system, Jackie's going to tell you about how we make research better. I'm going to give you two pieces of characterization to take down the bulk of Proposition's case. The first thing is to note is that Proposition can never get rid of the root problem they are trying to address, which is to say that neocolonialism exists in everything we do. It exists in the media we consume. It exists in the politics we watch. It exists in almost everything that happens, including our entertainment industries and even the sports we watch. At the point in which they're trying to say that the only way that they can get their impact is if somehow China or Singapore or Korea can reach an equal or even augmented footing in global status in America, we would say that that impact is far, far down the road and it's likely not going to happen in the next couple of centuries. The second thing I want to say is that it is likely impossible for these Asian countries to do the same thing as Western countries. That is to say, they're the ones who are setting up branch campuses in the West. They're the ones who are attracting foreign talent. They're the ones who are getting all their locals to it. There are a couple of reasons for this. Firstly, these countries have an inability to reach wide groups of people that are independent from the reasons that Proposition identified. And the fact that just because they have less prestige, less legacy, they have nominally worse professors and worse resources because nobody wants to go teach there if they're not, because of the fact that there's no prestige related to things such as Seoul National University or, for example, Tsinghua. But secondly, it's because the strict and rigid education systems of places such as Korea and China and Taiwan have been proven to fail. But these countries with their central command and authoritarian ideology have kept onto that form of education system to make sure that all of their students do is just swat tea every day and just take tests, and they're basically just machines that go out there and get high grades. We would say that that's one of the major reasons why Asian countries have never been able to break out of the education bubble, and that's why we think uniquely foreign universities can provide a service. Moving on to my first argument then about intercontinental relationships and why that is so important. The first thing I want to characterize to you today is why college is such a unique time for cultural exchange. Because understand that this is when people are most willing to break out of their bubble. This is when people are most open to new cultures. And this is when they're most impressionable and they're going to form long-term perceptions of their time in another place. I'm going to talk about the effect of these international branch campuses on two major groups of people. Firstly, on the effect on Asians, and secondly, on the effect of foreigners. The first thing is on the effect of Asians. I would like to note that Proposition concedes that there's a sizable portion of people who already in the status quo want to attend foreign universities. What I would say, the problem is that they are being discriminated against in terms of college admissions in a systematic fashion because of the fact that colleges feel as if Asians are oversaturating their campuses, or Asians have characteristically less interesting than white people. Because of this, we would say that international branch campuses are uniquely allows access to foreign education for those who want it. These people want it because they understand that it's important to intermingle with other cultures. They understand it's important to have a footing in a place outside of your home country. The second one is the effect on foreigners. I would like to note that this is the vast majority of people who attend IBCs. This is the vast majority of people, over 60%, are foreigners coming to places like Duke Kunshan, coming to places like NYU, Shanghai. Why are they coming to these places? Because there's a shift in understanding, which is to say that it is better for me to have my footing in both cultural spheres because China and Singapore and Korea are slowly rising as hegemons, as leaders inside of the global economy. When people understand that, there's an increased drive from the West to be able to better understand Chinese, Korean, and Singaporean culture and language. This is why, for example, Donald Trump's daughter speaks Chinese, or why a lot of people in Yale are trying to send their kids to China so that they can learn the language there. The problem is that in the status quo, it is extremely scary to set foot into a foreign land and go to a local school when nobody there speaks your language, when the resources there are geared towards Chinese nationals and Korean nationals rather than people of your ethnicity and your background. That is why it's extremely important that these foreign schools can set up branch campuses here that have resources, that have networks, that have infrastructure to be able to support these individuals. This is important because it means that this is uniquely how they would experience Asian society. So if Proposition wants to talk about the group of people who possibly could have forwarded their entire goal of enriching Asian culture and an Asian education system, they are only allowed to do that when you provide them with the tools necessary in order to experience Asian culture. What is the importance in a globalized society? Firstly, is cultural literacy. Note that this debate should boil down to one thing and one thing alone. Who better serves children in terms of education? Because universities are not supposed to be standing as principal mottos or philosophical representation of countries. They're supposed to be institutions that serve in order to enrich the lives of those who enroll in them. That means that when you are better able to teach people how to navigate both spheres of influence by teaching them the language, the norms, so they can live in China, they can live in the US, they can work for a US-based company in China, they can work for a Chinese-based company in the US. All of these things means that they have a better education and more job prospects in the long term. Secondly, in diversity, because when you have better, I'll take you in a second, thank you. When you have better intermingling and better cultural exchange between these individuals, that's when you can break down stereotypes. In a world in which there are so many stigmas put against other people because they look different from you, in a world in which there's an increasing trend towards certain countries with far-right populism, I would think it's important to have a generation of people who grew up working in close proximity to those who look different to them. Before I move on, I'll take your point.
So first of all, in many of these countries, let's say you still have the ability to teach in a liberal manner that does not require you to have constant stress of examinations. But also, if we still have things like foreign studies in universities in America and in universities in Asia, then you still are able to garner that globalized interest. What is the difference?
Here's the contradiction in that POI. You stated that geography itself is a unique factor in the conditions of a university, which is why you would much rather Chinese and South Korean have local universities rather than to crowdsource to expats. But the point in which you concede that we would say it's so important for people to be immersed in the country, to be constantly living there and talking to local people, to be forced to learn the language because they need to get around town and other things like that. Secondly, I want to talk about changes to the education system. 3 mechanisms as to why Asian education will change overall. Firstly, competition created by the existence of these campuses. They try to pin this as a bad thing, but what they said is that higher accessibility through lower tuitions is a bad thing. We would say that higher accessibility is always a good thing because it breeds market competition. Secondly, you set a precedent. And thirdly, resource trading collaboration. What this is a vault Asian education ahead because they're forced to internationalize and fill in the gap that originally made them weak in the first place. But secondly, more importantly, it provides local Asians who originally had to go through the excruciating pain of college entrance exams like the Gaokao or in South Korea. They are now allowed to break free from that and opt into a better option if they choose to do so. For all these reasons, extremely proud to stand in opposition.
Hi, I'm so sorry. Can I use the washroom? 1 minute.
Sure.
Thank you.
All right, thank you, Leader of Opposition, for that speech. Let's invite Deputy Prime Minister.
Okay. Madam Chair, the key problem with side of opposition today is that they only wanted to focus on the smallest of things, i.e. cultural exchange, wanting to learn about what Western education was like, wanting to learn about what Asian education was like. We never once heard from them a rebuttal to the vast majority of the analysis that Jerome provided to you about the long-standing and wider implications of what the proliferation of Western universities within Asian countries look like. We think we need to evaluate this debate on a macro scale. But here's the issue, Madam Chair. We concede and we accept that this debate operates on a scale, that we probably have less cultural exchange on our side, that we probably have less Western influence on our side. But then it is about what scale is acceptable and where we draw the line. We say at a point at which you enforce your own extension of imperialism through the establishment of Western campuses, which fundamentally degrades your ability as an Asian nation to develop your education system, but you necessarily deprive your nation through brain drain and impose your own Western cultures. That's the point at which we say we draw the line, and we say that that needs to stop. I'll do a few things in my speech. The first, in response to what they said in their first speaker. So they first came up and said that neo-colonialism exists in everything, through the media whatsoever. I would posit to you that the very analysis that they gave us as to why this is the perfect time for cultural exchange, that people are impressionable, that people are accepting of different values, and that they're going to be easily convinced, is analysis that proves that education and your 4 years in universities is literally the kingpin to how you influence your mind. It is the kingpin by which you form your thoughts and impressions. If that is the analysis and we buy it, we see that's the point at which you enforce your imperialism, and that's when it's most pernicious. They considered that with their own analysis. But the second thing they said is that our strict education system was failing. Madam Chair, I want you to just consider how racist of a conception of education this is. That for some reason, it is always the liberal ideology, or it is always the Western ideology that was superior to our forms of teaching. We say that we've seen a vast, extremely good results in many countries in Asia, i.e. Thailand, i.e. Philippines, i.e. Malaysia, in which we've been able to produce some of the finest doctors, some of the finest public servants that we've seen, right? So, i.e. Dr. Nur Hisham in Malaysia and his treatment of the COVID-19 crisis. We think, but furthermore, and we go a step further in saying that even if there might be some very strict ones, we always have counteracting education systems that might not necessarily be Western, those of Western universities. So we have other conceptions of education within our country, but that might not be as Western, but at least they're not on the scale that they wanted to posit to us. Okay, the bulk of the material was like, we like cultural exchange. And they said, firstly, that now white people are scared to go to Asian countries because they're scared of Asians when there's no like a Western university. I think this is absurd just by virtue of the fact that we see so many Asians flocking to Western universities, and like there's millions of us literally moving to these universities. I do not see why it won't happen the other way round. But here's the thing. This is not mutually exclusive, because on both sides of the house, in an increasingly globalized world, we will still have things like trade. We will still have exchanges, which still happen under our side of the house. So Tsinghua has exchanges with Harvard. So Taylor's has exchanges with Cambridge. So Sunway has exchanges with Oxford. We recognize that it operates on the scale, but I will prove to you in my substantive why on their side of the house, the scale is unacceptable and they fundamentally degrade each Asian nation fundamentally. First, I'll expand on what Jerome said with regards to why the establishment of Western campuses fundamentally degrade your ability as an Asian nation to develop. First, it is to note that this trend is extremely large in scale, okay? Let's not like kid around here. The increasing trend of the proliferation of Western universities has seen the movement of thousands of universities in almost every nation in Asia, right? So we see this through in Malaysia, through Nottingham, through Bristol. We see it in Singapore through Yale, NUS, whatsoever. We say it, and what Jerome told you is that necessarily the glorification of Western universities through culture normative worldviews that are shaped by things like the media, through conversations I have with my parents, that Harvard is where I should aspire to be, necessarily creates this ideology of Western values which are somehow superior, or that I should one day aspire to go to a Western university. Here are the impacts of that. Number one, a lot we concede. This is not about extreme. So the ultra rich on both sides of the house will flock over to other countries in the world, right? But the middle or upper class of individuals who might want to stay in their countries are now coerced into Western universities through a manufactured consent. We say this is manufactured consent necessarily because A, it is not necessarily true that local universities are worse, right? But secondly, so we would give to you how UM is actually, like University of Malaya, is actually a better university in Nottingham, but people still flock to these Western universities by virtue of them having white faces or a nice accent, right? But we say in many instances, their value of education is not as great. So NYU proliferated its university campuses throughout Abu Dhabi. This decreased the standard of education because they had less regulation and less care for how they were actually teaching. So what that proves is that NYU in US might be great, but the false facade by which they hide through it means that they do not have to provide as good of an education within local Asian countries. What this necessarily means is that considering the status quo in which governments already have very little incentive to want to invest into things like education, right? They further divide that on their side of the house when governments can say, look, we already have a bunch of Western universities moving in. I do not see why necessarily I have to provide for that. They make it far worse under their side. That means that local populations are deprived of the ability to succeed within their local context. I will prove this now to you in the second argument and how you deprive developing nations of human capital necessary for the development of the country. Notice that most of these individuals who are going to be flocking to Western universities are individuals who mainly constitute of maybe the middle upper class, people who have skills, families who want to invest in a Western education because they believe it will be better for them. This means that they necessarily go towards these universities. Here's what they do in university. They do things like exchange programs and send you to Yale for 3 or 4 years. They indoctrinate you with ideas that freedom of speech, that things like human rights are essential in the pursuit of a good education. What all of these systematically mean is that they indoctrinate and brainwash you into believing that those forms of lives are better. That means that in the future, you are more likely to want to go and move out of your country. You are less likely to have more of a nationalist sentiment in wanting to remain and develop your country. We say you deprive your very country of the best resources necessary to the development of your nation. That in the vast majority of Asian nations, which are currently second or third world and developing nations, when we crucially need this human capital, they deprive them of it. You get the flocking out of doctors, of engineers, of physicists that we think are crucial to the development of your society. But lastly, on the imposition of Western values and cultures, we think in a vast majority of instances, it is actually not true that a Western ideology is superior, right? So many Western countries always like to focus on things like freedom of speech as being the thing we should aspire, whereas they neglect other things like economic rights. Like in Qatar, where they might not necessarily have such great freedom of speech, their government is so good in providing material wealth to them, which we think are other conceptions of morality or other conceptions of the good life that we think should be able to be taught within these countries, right? For all those reasons, we are the ones who side with Asia and the development of developing nations. We're very proud to propose.
Thank you, DPM, for that speech. Let's invite Diallo.
Hi, yes, 1 second, please. Yeah. For some reason on their side, the sphere of education is a free market for each country to try to out-alpha each other instead of provide the best education for children. They run their children as chess pieces in this game of geopolitics between countries, and that's inherently unethical. But more importantly, for an Asian community, the only way you can prop yourself up and increase your foothold in the international stage is where you have the best politicians, the best entertainers to dominate the entertainment industry, to dominate the business industry and everything above. And this can only be done if they're in touch with the globalized community, in touch with this culture, to use it to their own advantage, and that is how you can change global order that's not touched on their side. Before the questions in this speech, one contradiction and characterization that we want to point out. Their first speaker said there's this huge problem of Western dominance and imperialism that they want to solve. But the second speaker said, look, it's natural that Westerners are also going to be moving to China naturally on our side as well, that they're also going to be trading relationships and human capital and everything like that. So is there a sense of Western dominance where everyone flocked to the United States, or actually is there actually existing trade that they naturally want to advocate on their side? They can't have their cake and eat it too. This contradiction and characterization is damaging. But three other things in my speech. Firstly, who reforms education for students? Secondly, who helps solve like intercontinental dynamics and equalize the playing field? And lastly, who has better research between universities which can help increase knowledge for all? Firstly, on reforming education for students. Note how they have no impact here. They have no impact as to why they increase opportunities, choices, or education quality for any of the students, which already random them to lose. University is about bettering the futures of all of these kids, not about like a free market of competition. That's why they fall. But three additional impacts we have under this. Firstly, we increase learning styles and choices because this university is not entirely Western or Asian, because there's a compromise in between. NYU Shanghai's board is half composed of professors from East China Normal University. What does this mean? When they each have half of the vote, they will vote on compromises. Some aspects they'll take from Western university teaching styles and some from Eastern university teaching styles, which means we're actually adding a third type of learning style for students to choose what is the most suitable for them. This means that this is not a choice that students can access entirely on their side. Students are better served in our world. But two, the mix of cultures is important. Eddie told you why this cultural literacy is fostered. And this helps Asian students especially, because if there's already a dominance of multinational corporations in the UN and WHO, they all speak English, they work in a Western democratic way, and there's a dominance in the Hollywood and the entertainment industry, then for you to change the game rules, you need to understand their rules first. You need to be able to compete with them in that existing rule framework, to be able to uplift Asian artists, to be able to uplift Asian people to have a voice in these global arenas as well. So when Eddie tells you it's the best time to accept culture, it doesn't mean getting brainwashed. It means to foster this compromised and globalized culture in university that can help Asian people have a stronger foothold. But three, we increase opportunities for Asians, because currently they're structurally blocked out of many opportunities. One, the Gaokao is very cutthroat, and that's the existing structure they have in like Korea with the examination system. And if you fail at examinations, you're likely to fail in that local system. But if you want to move abroad, that requires you to have money, because it's an entire ship from one end of the world to another, and you still have to face discrimination in the admissions process. Therefore, when you offer something that's more local, that means you can escape Gaokao if it's not for you, and if you don't have money, you can still go to this education opportunity. All of these things increases accessibility of education for students, and since education is to serve students on the ground, we already win. But secondly, let's engage on their clash of making intercontinental dynamics better by responding to your 2 points. Firstly, they say neocolonialism and how they solve. 3 rebuttals. 1, if they're so anti-neocolonialism, the logical extension is to block out anything that has an extreme influence on Western supremacy, and that is the media industry that they're characterized promoting like Western like white supremacy and all of these things. Then they would also suggest popping up firewalls instead of like supporting the freedom of information that they have been talking about down the entire bench, because that is how you can stop the like increase in Western supremacy and make Asians feel good about themselves. But that is against the whole point of accessing information. But 2, this sentiment exists before the satellite campuses as they characterize, that people are only flocking to satellite campuses because they already perceive Western supremacy. Then we don't understand why removing satellite campuses will be able to resolve this problem at all. But 3, if these ideals are indoctrinating the student's mind, it's about feminism, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and LGBTQ like rights, then we have no problem with them having exposure to these ideas. Note how college students are the ones who have critical thinking. They have proven how they are like intellectually capable of going to these universities to challenge ideas and to have this type of discourse. course. This means they can choose for themselves what is a
Fine.
good idea they accept from the West and what is not. That's why you see Chinese university students slowly start LGBTQ parades. All these is due to interaction with information. But then they say there's going to be brain drain. We tell you brain drain actually decreases if you understand how the application system works. If you're in the Gaokao system, in the local examination system, you can't suddenly go to NYU Shanghai because the application is different there. You need to fill out the common application. You need the SAT or the ACT. You need the American testing. You need the American application. That's why most people who apply to NYU Shanghai are those who are already applying to NYU and take a box to say, I also want to go to NYU Shanghai. I also want to apply to Yale and US. That's why what you're actually doing is for the kids who would have chosen to go to Yale, go into Connecticut, you're telling them you have an option to stay in your own community as well. You're actually drawing people who would have gone to Western universities to stay in an Asian community, so you're actually decreasing brain drain in this aspect. But lastly, my point is about how there's going to be better research on both sides of the house, and knowledge benefits everyone across the globe. I'll take a POI before that.
So you can still teach liberal arts. There are universities like Peking University and Renmin University in China who grew liberal arts without the addition of American universities.
Got
If
it.
Gaokao
Two
is
things.
so competitive, then
Yeah.
then SAT would just be as competitive in those
Got it, got
countries anyhow.
Two things. One, an entirely Chinese university with no one on the board propagating the Western learning style has no reason to move towards that, because everyone has already fostered from this like Asian type of learning style to like incorporate any elements of the Western. They are already believing in that existing learning style. But two, the Chinese system and like many Asian systems have an established hierarchy of schools already. At Tsinghua is on the top. Shifan University is not trying to compete that because the order is very set. When you increase competition is when schools are going to try to innovate through giving you other opportunities like liberal arts, language programs, or like increasing STEM funding for us to have better education and incorporate other aspects. Without this newcomer as competition, there's no incentive to change and pour more money into better education. But why is there better research? One, you override linguistic barriers, because currently studies are only explicitly published in one language. That's why when US universities, they only cite within the US circuit of universities that publish studies. That's why there's limited collaboration that makes knowledge and building on top of knowledge incredibly slow. What's the example? In the H1N1 break, they actually had a crucial information on one strand of that like data piece that was published already in Chinese papers. But if you look at the papers in the same period of time published in US universities, that crucial piece of information was missed because they were only citing between each other, missing that study from China. This means that this lack of information could have stunted scientific growth, that could have helped to tackle an outbreak entirely and have information that benefits all. Since there's a language barrier in many of the Asian communities like Korea, Japan, and China, we better the collaboration when the dynamic and the two linguistic board members will foster this type of collaboration and study that's published in both languages and more accessible to all. But two, there are more research opportunities because grants right now are extremely restricted in China to foreigners entirely because they see them as untrustworthy. They don't trust like a complete foreigner to come in and study. When there's a collaboration board and you can still access the East China Normal University, an established institution, this trust suddenly goes up, which means other people can come into the country and study China, offer a diverse point of view, and thus find out more truths in the scientific community. This helps the Asian community they care about so much too, because they already published less paper in the global arena because this culture was only newly formed. They were usually more popular in Western cultures. But if you have access to NYU's old studies, old data set, old resources in their entire database, that helps this collaboration, that can increase the publishing of Asian authors, Asian publishers, and Asian professors. And this increases Asians' foothold and influence in the education arena as well. The best education and the best future is the only way to increase Asian foothold. We're so proud to oppose.
All right, thank you, DLO, for that speech. Let's invite Government Whip.
Test, can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
The very conceptions that the side of opposition has when they tell you these are the only applicable ways in order for students on the ground in these countries to gain a useful education, an education of high standard, is the very reason the Western imposition has clouded the judgment and the minds of individuals all across the globe.
We missed the first portion of your speech. Would you mind starting over? I'm so sorry.
Can I restart?
Yeah, we got disconnected. I'm really sorry.
Oh,
Okay, yeah, sure. You can restart.
Okay. The misconception coming from side of opposition that the only way to get a good education is through a Western institution within your localized community. It's the very downfall of their case, because this is a misconception that is bred through these branch campuses, when they never wanted to engage with the examples in which we told you there are local universities within these Asian countries that can proliferate just as good students, and that the namesake of the university merely being NYU in Hong Kong only gets you prestige and nothing else. They can't tell you that merely being associated with a good university equates to you providing a good education. A major problem of branch universities all across the globe, the reason a mass amounts of them have to shut down or are unsuccessful is because of the lack of quality and the lack of ability for students to actually proliferate a good education within those systems, because mass amounts of these university systems are incompatible with the way in which we learn that they say we need to cultivate and change in the first place. This is the very reason those institutions fail the community and fail to educate the people they wanted to protect. Before I move on to my two issues, number one, on the idea of education and which will do we truly garner a better education for the individuals on the ground, and number two, we will engage with them on the cultural aspects that they wanted to bring up an importance to. But before I move on to those, a few levels of rebuttals. Now we have to take out the things that are irrelevant from these speeches from the side of opposition. What has this speaker before me told you? One of the components of her speech was to tell you how it's great that we have a decrease in language barriers, the point in which we have international institutions. We think, number one, they never told us why only having this institution means this is the only way to break down these barriers. We think when we have an international recognition, when we tell people in the West that Mandarin is going to be the language that takes over the world, and individuals within those countries send their children for Mandarin classes because it's the business language that's going to evolve in the very future. These are narratives that are sufficient. But number two, on the very absurd idea that you're going to slow down research progress like H1N1 due to a language barrier. We think this idea is a complete fallacy. We think in research, you actually have translators within this because these are actual important documents that you have to forward. We don't think you need to speak English like every Western individual in the first place. But then we beg the question, why is the international language supposedly English? Why in the international scale for research, why can't everyone speak Korean or speak Chinese and Mandarin? Why is it immediately institutionalized to a Western form of language? We don't think a language barrier is something that's sufficient or is even a harm in the first place, because we have things to mitigate these kinds of things. Number two, they told us that Western supremacy is already prevalent in societies, and if that's the case, we should ban all forms of like media in the first place. Notice the unique context they brought to you of university students, the extremely malleable forms of these individuals. This is why we don't want these individuals to be cultivated in society or cultivated in a constant university life that propagates things against your own country. When you're taught in Saudi Arabia that free speech is good, that your country is oppressive, that your country, and you should flee your country and go for prospects abroad. These are the individuals that you lose on the side of opposition, the people that actually propagate your economy, the people that cultivate a better country for you as a whole. And lastly, before I move on to my issues, they told us on how that the education systems here better prove this, and I'll move on to my issues now. Before I move on, sure.
So at best, your mechanism to uproot cultural imperialism is negative in the sense that it stops people from buying into it. We provide you with an actual link to say that cultural exchange is better because when you foster diversity, that's when people are going to stop glorifying the West.
Now let's take a look, and to answer this, we have to take a look at the context and the demographic of individuals that attend these branch campuses. We don't see, number one, a large influx of foreign individuals that want to magically migrate to Malaysia to study in the first place. The vast instances of these individuals are, number one, privileged people that have the ability to just move abroad to, number one, a less like sustainable college. Like, why not go to NYU in your country instead of going to one in Malaysia or one in Hong Kong or Abu Dhabi? We think there are multiple, like there are so many other prospects you can procure within your own home country. And it's extremely privileged ideology to want to move countries to simply learn their culture. But number two, we think if you're able to want to go to an Asian country in the first place, these are not the demographic of people that need the cultural appropriation or the cultural knowledge. These are probably individuals that aren't going to be racist against Chinese people when they go to Hong Kong. Because why would I go to Hong Kong if I hate all Chinese people? This is not the demographic we want to change. And number three, to mitigate this as a whole, we don't think universities are the only gateway for cultural assimilation. We think because they've already told you examples, like your local media, when we have representation in TV shows, when Asian celebrities get more and more recognition, like Parasite winning the Grammy Awards and people recognizing how Asian people can be successful too. We think these are things that proliferate well in our world. And on education, and how on our side, we told you we have a better, more comprehensive education system for everyone on a macro scale, and how it also benefits individuals on the ground. Notice the individuals that attend these Western universities in your Asian countries are probably individuals that are unable to procure, like go to universities abroad because they lack capital and funds. These are probably going to be the individuals that stay within your country, the point at which they graduate from that Western branch campus. We then tell you, and we're going to prove to you that my first two speakers have already told you, is why these are individuals that are worse off. Look at countries like the United Arab Emirates with the highest concentration of Western branch campuses, and look at how hard it is for individuals that attend these universities to find a job because of the lack of prestige tied to it. Because in the local economy, being part of the Nottingham University of the local country does not get you anything, when only NYU in the States has a top 50 rating across the globe, but the NYU in Hong Kong does not. We tell you this is prestige that is false and it's a facade, and it's problematic when you lure students in, telling them that this is an opportunity you cannot miss, that this is something that will garner you prospects in the future. We think a vast amount of individuals will benefit from an actual local university where the local demand and supply understand like the concepts or the prestige of a university on the ground comparative to one overseas on a Western branch campus. What we then told you, and they never wanted to respond to you, is how we changed the education systems in these Asian countries. When we told you your conception of education and how the best is always seen as a Western ideology, when all the best institutions, or the point in which you think of education, you think of going to Western countries. This is because of the penetration of Western universities within these areas. And we told you how you crowd out other universities, the local universities, and how governments have less incentive. Because notice this trend: if your entire base of universities is going to be captured by the Western market, by these privatized markets in the first place, then there's no way for local universities to compete when all students should just flock to these institutions in the very first place. We think then the vast amounts of individuals that aren't privileged enough to attend these private universities, because even if they have cheap subsidies or they have cheap tuition fees, the vast amounts of individuals require public education to actually succeed. These are the people that lose out in the side of opposition. These are the people they never wanted to engage with. We tell you, you lose resources and fundings, the point in which individuals crowd into these universities in the first place. We tell you in the long run, we create a better, more comprehensive education system, the point in which we don't have Western imposition in the very first place. We're very proud to propose.
All right, thank you for that speech. Let's invite Opposition Whip.
Hi, just 1 second. Can everybody see and hear me? Oh, are we all good?
Yep, whenever you're ready.
Okay. When their last speaker conceded there would be a crowding out effect in which all students of Chinese and Singaporean origin are going to flock to these universities, they conceded that these are just the most attractive option for most students. We think the point at which they concede that, we tell you that giving these students the most choice, give them the ability to choose what's best for their future, is what we stand for on Team Opposition. We don't understand why we need to confine them and imprison them into one certain system that they're unfortunately born into. They concede our benefits when they said that sentence. Two main clashes in today's debate. One, let's talk about neocolonialism and brain drain. And two, let's talk about the quality of education and internationalism. So first, let's go into the clash of neocolonialism and brain drain. It tells us a few things. One, this was cultural imperialism. But down the bench, they simply just kept repeating this. But we told you that wasn't true. Because the premise of imperialism was that one side was disproportionately stronger and had control and power over the other, with no say from the other side. But that clearly just wasn't true in the fact that Yale and US had a majority of professors from Singapore, not from the US, in the sense that East China Normal University ran the vast majority of board members in terms of Yale, in terms of NYU Shanghai. That clearly was imperialism when these local universities are the ones who are able to run and administer a lot of the issues that go on at that school. We think uniquely they do not get the impact of colonialism. But two, even if we take them at their best and say this was cultural imperialism, we tell the obsession with the West existed very, very early on. The obsession with the West came when they talked to you about things like Chinese women wanting to marry white men. That happened like decades ago before the establishment of these schools. So what you're doing is you're not reading the idea of Western imperialism and Western glorification. You're denying students of the chance to pursue their dreams that would have existed on either sides of the house. So we don't think they get anything on their side. But two, the second thing to tell you was there's a brainwashing of Western ideas, and that's uniquely bad because you cause conflict. Three main responses. One, that's just simply not true. There's an equal representation of a lot of the ideas that come into these countries. That the sphere of influence that you get in NYU Shanghai, for example, is very different from the sphere of influence you get from NYU in New York itself. You get a mixture of all kinds of ideas that my second and first speakers told you about, in which these professors come from various backgrounds, and you're able to choose for yourself an integration or a mixture of these ideas that you don't get from just Tsinghua University from a local basis. That even though you are impressionable, sure, which we told you that is true, that you're still able to be smart and evaluate what is best for you. You're not so easily deceived by all other countries. But two, let's take them at their best and say that these people are so easily deceived and they're automatically going to revert to Western ideas. But the worst Western ideas they could even name to you in their deputy speaker was things like liberalism and human rights. That's not such a bad thing. I would say that like these individuals coming back to China and saying, you need to protect LGBT rights. You need to protect, like, stop oppressing individuals who are living in Xinjiang, for example. That these are not things that are so bad for, like, we don't understand why teaching them these ideas of equality and equal representation and freedom of expression are things that are so bad. Sure, they cause short-term conflict, but there's long-term progression of those countries. We're very, very happy to stand on behalf of those people. But third, if they wanted to talk to you about constrainment and the idea and the ability of these individuals to keep themselves and not to be brainwashed, I would say the most brainwashing thing for them to stand for is confining them to the system that they were born into. That it is the most brainwashing for Chinese universities to say that you need to grow up in this one particular system and confined to ideas like obedience, confined to things like what we tell you is Chinese nationalism, Chinese morality, etc. That is the most brainwashing ideologies. At least we give them a choice on our side of the house. But before I go on, I'll take a point.
In what world can you impose things like LGBT rights and feminism in a country like Saudi Arabia when they control and have conditional, like there's a condition to you opening your university in the country in the first place?
Okay, first of all, the Saudi Arabian example came from you. But I would also say that in countries like China, there are impacts of these conservative countries opening up in the sense that we have people like the Feminist Five who are standing for feminist protests, people like talking to the Women's Federation in China and the establishment of these organizations. Like, I think there is progress, and it's not enough for you to assert that they simply don't exist. That also contradicts your previous speech about like Saudi Arabian women, right? So we think that we win this clash pretty easily. But the next thing they tell you was, look, we can have like liberalized ideas on our side of the house no matter what for some reason, because Tsinghua is already liberalizing. First of all, that was a massive concession that liberalization is a good thing in the very first place. They literally crossed the house when they said that. But two, the reason why Tsinghua University felt pressured to liberalize in the first place was because they wanted to get back students that were going into NYU Shanghai. So without this marketplace of ideas that came from these branches of international universities, you do not get that on our side. Tsinghua would never have liberalized and opened up. We don't think they went on that clash. And the final thing they told you was manufactured consent, in which these individuals are going to be forced to go to NYU Shanghai, for example. But we already told you why these individuals are going to, that these individuals are actually more likely to go to NYU Shanghai than go to NYU in New York, because of the precise reason of nationalism that they mentioned to you, that these individuals actually feel a tie to their country. So on their side of the house, if these branches did not exist, these are the individuals who would have flocked to New York, flocked to Connecticut. But on our side, when they have branches in their home countries, because they already have existing nationalistic ties to their original country, they're more likely to stay in these particular schools, graduate from there, and possibly come back, have a higher chance of coming back because they grew up here we think these are the individuals that are able to progress China or progress Singapore the best way. So second main question on the idea of internationalism and how that impacts the quality of education. First of all, they told you that a lot of universities are closing down because of how terrible their education is. Sure, we'll let the bad ones close down, we'll let the good ones stay. NYU Shanghai is doing pretty well. That was also really new material. Second thing they tell you was internationalism is already achieved by media, etc. But no, right? Like you need to have complete integration if you're living in that particular country. And that was extremely clear coming from even our first speaker when we told you, sure, these individuals are somewhat curious about what China looks like, but simply reading like Xinhua newspapers isn't going to have the same experience as you literally immersing yourself in that particular culture, talking with those people, going to those regional like places. We think that is what you get from 4 years of experience in Shanghai versus reading Chinese newspapers or attending Mandarin classes, which was like a ridiculous alternative for them to push. But two, if they said that things like local media and Asian celebrities were things that they would support on their side, then they're pretty much crossing the house conceding our benefits that these people should be somewhat westernized and should be liberalized. We think the best way to do that is to let them go into China. The final thing under this was the idea of research translation, which was a crucial impact they were very, very flippant about. When they said things like, oh, you can just have translation and that's not really a problem. But Jackie made it quite clear that there's already like a vast majority of very much ignored papers written in China, clearly demonstrating that there isn't an incentive for translators to come in and translate these things. Why? Because translation is a very unglorious and unprofitable job because it takes a huge amount of time without anybody recognizing you as a translator. Scientists don't have the incentive to translate. But even if they did, there is a massive problem there because there's a time lag. The H1N1 virus outbreak went viral over the course of 2 weeks. You probably need like 2 years to translate that paper properly. But two, these translators probably do not have the complete capacity to understand both languages so entirely that they're able to translate everything with 100% accuracy. The more acceptable solution would to have cultural integration in which everybody, including Western scientists, are able to read some degree of Chinese and answer that for themselves rather than rely on some kind of translator. And the next thing I told you was quite strange when they were like, we shouldn't just have one language. Like, yeah, we agree with you that you should have one language, but the unfortunate truth is there is one language that dominates science, unfortunately, and that just so happens to be the truth of the world. So the best way to solve that, given that both sides of this debate have the same goal, is to have everybody integrated on an international scale, to have people like Donald Trump's daughter come to China and receive education here and to realize the benefits of learning Chinese for herself or for themselves. We would say it's not true for them to say that, oh, you can just take Mandarin class sometimes outside of school. We get the massive benefit of getting more and better research and better understood research, which is one of the most major goals of why universities exist in the very, very first place. Finally, then let's engage with their idea on prestige. That NYU is always more prestigious than NYU Shanghai. Like off the top of that, I don't think that's necessarily true because your diploma says the same thing. Your diploma doesn't necessarily have to specify that you came from a certain branch. So we don't think that problem of prestige applies anyway. But we would also say that NYU Shanghai is ranked a lot higher, for example, than East China Normal University. So we say that having that degree is much more prestigious than the alternative. We're very, very proud to stand on team opposition.
All right, thank you, Opwit, for that speech. Let's invite Op Reply.
On-site proposition. The future and fate of the youth of our nation is owned by countries who are trying to establish themselves in the global foothold. It is owned by the universities who are trying to spread their culture, who are trying to indoctrinate people, who are trying to alpha them in terms of their culture. We believe education is about breaking down walls and propping up bridges between these nations of students. It is about giving them the best opportunities, the most access to the world stage, and that's why we already win this debate. The first thing I want to tell you is that they have shifting characterization of the world whenever it is convenient for their side of the house. Sometimes they say there's a complete Western dominance. We're brainwashed to marry only white men, and there's a huge imperialism that exists. But sometimes their rebuttal to us is saying it is already getting better. You see Parasite winning the Oscars and using this as a cultural form of exchange. There's a natural flow of reciprocal people from different nations, and thus culture is being transmitted. So I don't understand why they can characterize neocolonialism as the biggest problem of this debate if they themselves think it's already a liberalizing trend that's solving the problem. But we have always assumed that it is a problem to tackle, or we've engaged them on their best ground. grounds. Here's the thing. They still have no mechanism to solve this problem, and their mechanism is entirely negative. They say that they're going to change education, but at the same time, politics, entertainment, health industry, everything else is still dominated by the Western industry, and there's still imperialism and indoctrination that exists, so no impact on their side. But we said, if the UN and MNCs and WHO, all these foundations are dominated by the democratic work of working, dominated by the US culture and the way of interacting with people, then we should equip Asian students the understanding of these rules, the ability to succeed in these cultures so they can go to top, succeed, and then change the rules to increase the Asian foothold in these organizations. That is how you can uplift neocolonialism, which was not engaged at all by their side. And then they say brain drain, which only link they provide is that you'll stay and work after the few months of exchange programs. But more than a few months is the few years, additional years that you spend in the Asian community in this country, where you create a tie and like you want to work for this country and better this university, so you will stay. But more importantly, they never engage your analysis on how the application system works. That you're likely to save people who are going out of the country, who are going to the US anyway, when they take the box that says, I want to go to this Asian community as well. This is why brain drain is flipped as well. But the second thing we want to tell you is that they have no consideration of students, the argument that Eddie spent so much time building up, which already wins us the debate, because that is the crux of education, not about geopolitics between countries. For Asian students, this means kids no longer have to go through the cutthroat approach of Gaokao. They can quit early in high school and determine that they just want to stay in this community, but go for a more Western type of education, a more like NYU Shanghai like system and that application process to escape the cutthroat approach if it's not suitable for their mental health. It means that the choice between Western and Eastern education and the location of your studies is no longer dictated as a luxury for only the rich to choose to be able to move abroad. That choice itself benefits multiple families, and that's something we defend. But for foreigners, this is a chance for them to touch on this rising economy of China, of Singapore, who's dominating the world stage as well. As they said, Mandarin is about to become the biggest language. That is when we can move down these cultural barriers, because you don't need to fit into Gaokao or entire Chinese systems to come to China and study. You can have this platform of NYU Shanghai to compromise. For the locals, we help them as well, because we respond to multiple POI by saying competition urges local universities to be better as well, that they'll liberalize or spend more money on STEM programs because there are newcomers like NYU Shanghai coming in with the money, and they have to keep their students, and that's how you make locals' lives better as well. For all these student actors, they already lose. But by the end, they conceded to our biggest impact of cultural exchange as well. When they asked the POI that says Saudi Arabia is receiving like this type of information on feminism and things like LGBTQ rights, they concede that this cultural exchange as a mechanism do exist by the end. Then their only attack is, well, the Saudi Arabian government is also going to indoctrinate you, so there's no effect. But that's the necessity of a counter narrative. If the government is already brainwashing with Xinhua news sources or indoctrinating you to stay in a nation and keep to the ideals of collective good and like ignore all these individual rights, it shows that a domination of one culture is needed in this case to tell you you can stand up for your rights, to tell you you can benefit your own lives. This is when, even if brainwashing is the impact on our side, if it means women have more access to contraceptives and choice, we're so happy to defend that. On the issue of scientific research, their only response was translation. When we framed it in terms of the time frame, we framed it in terms of the urgency, the accuracy, and authenticity of such studies, and we even employ talk of Asian professors. So on their side, none of human lives are actually benefited. Do not let them win for fluffy principles we're so proud to oppose.
All right, thank you for that speech. Let's invite the final speaker.
Madam Chair, let's for a second peel back the flowery analysis of OP and see what their underlying principles were. That English is superior and that liberal ideology was the best. This is racist. We told you from the beginning that each country was able to sustain itself in a way that could help its citizens and provide a good form of education. Why was that not something that they would be able to understand and contend with? We pointed to you multiple examples of succeeding Asian universities, that it is their very perception that they build under their side of the house that creates this false facade that it is the West that is superior. For the side that wanted to stand for choice, they would deprive choice from individuals whose developing countries would suffer from brain drain. For the side who wanted to side with choice, they would crowd out local universities and stifle the ability and chain nations to the mercy of Western universities. We say that is abhorrent. I'll make this simple for you. First, on the education system within Asian countries. We told you on multiple levels why it would be better under our side. Don't let them get away with assertive rhetoric under their side of the house that we have no mechanism or we don't change anything under our side. We firstly told you that a lot of their benefits are watered down because Western education is glorified and students flock to them even though they are not that good. So notice that when you branch out as a university, whether it be NYU whatsoever, your education is often watered down because of the sort of regulation that you're able to impose, because of the sorts of professors you're able to employ. That means that they often have pretty bad education and unable to live up to the names and hide behind the facade of their reputation. But secondly, we also told you that local countries have great education. So we point to you examples of the University of Malaya, UT Mara, IIUM, Hong Kong University. All of these are currently really, really good universities that have rankings in the top 100. Why was this something not contended with? Why was it always that they wanted to say that Western universities were the best? But then we crucially told you that under their policy and under the proliferation of Western universities, that necessarily means that governments do not have an incentive to invest into the education system of the country. That fundamentally not only deprives people in the middle and upper class, but also of the poorer classes who will necessarily rely on those forms of education in order to get better future prospects, right? But lastly, we told you that there were also, in contending with their best case scenario, there were also different conceptions of local education. And the reason this is not a contradiction, and notice they tried to assert that this was a contradiction, the delineation is this. Local liberal education might teach you some values about what the West stands for whatsoever. But Western branches necessarily have the sole aim of convincing you to want to migrate to the US and glorify the US whatsoever. They often have aid from governments through subsidies whatsoever to convince students to move to be economically productive, right? We pointed out to you that for 4 years, they would use these impressionable teens and instrumentalize them to be a future economic productive, like, vessels, right? Yeah. Secondly, on cultural exchange, we said from the very beginning, this was not a binary. Don't let them paint this false picture. That is always operated on a scale, and in which world would it be better? I think we still have lots of cultural exchange on our side of the house. So the debater, we all know, Bosio goes to Tsinghua University, right? Which is not necessarily a Western education. We'll point to you many other examples, right? But we say, furthermore, let's look at it on a macro level, that even if you buy their point on cultural exchange, this should never come at a cost of depriving your nation of political capital necessary to develop and improve. But also, it should never come at a cost of draining your government of human capital. So on a macro level and evaluating this from a meta, like debating perspective, we still win. Finally, on brain drain, they said we didn't understand how application system work. You can pick a box. Let's be reasonable about this. Western universities take 4 years to convince these impressionable students and glorify the West to move, right? The logical conclusion then is that they would want to live a life in the West and to be able to enjoy the best forms of these forms of education and work. In those instances, I think the logical conclusion that they were trying to be very convenient with is that you do result in brain drain and deprive these nations. For all those reasons, we're very, very proud to propose.
All right, thank you for that speech. Thank you everyone for the debate. As you know, this is a silent round, so I will not be giving results and feedback. I think we can all go back to the main room and wait for the break announcements. Thank you.
Thank you.
Got it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank
And thank you,
you.
Team Malaysia, for debating us.
Thank you,
You
Team
guys
China.
too. Y'all were great.
Good luck, guys.
See you
Good
next
luck,
time.
guys. Bye.
If anyone from Weaver is on, can you reply the private message?
Benjamin, when the main room, don't talk about the tab. VAT, can they hear me? Can you hear me, VAT?
Sir,
Kathy, can you hear me? Kathy? Kathy?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I just want to do a sound check. Everybody, we have all the ballots. We are going to take the next 50 minutes to confirm the results and put them on slides so that the announcement will be a bit of a segment for you. So you have about 40 minutes now to go get a drink, have a quick bite. Like we said, if you are a breaking team in the octo final, we are not going to allow you to have lunch. So you might want to get something to eat in anticipation that you break. So we'll come back at 12:30 sharp. So be back here at 12:30. Don't leave the Zoom, just leave it on and return. And when we are ready, we will just say something and then you come back. At 12:30 is the deadline to come back. Thank you very much.